Hey there, travel friends. I recently returned from my very first cruise to Alaska. And while the trip started off with a few unexpected bumps along the way, it didn't take away from what ended up being an incredible experience. From arriving in beautiful Vancouver, Canada, to exploring the charming towns of Ketchikan, Sitka, and Skagway, every day seemed to get better and colder. And don't even get me started on the scenery. Every time I stepped out onto my balcony, there was another breathtaking mountain, glacier carved landscape, or picture perfect view waiting for me. Now, if you've followed me for a while, you know that I always try to give my most honest and humble opinion based on my personal experience. So in this video, I'm going to share the good, the unexpected, and everything in between while focusing on what made this journey so special. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and come along with me as I take you through my Alaska adventure aboard Royal Caribbean's Ovation of the Seas. Once I arrived in Vancouver, I spent some time exploring around the Georgian Court Hotel before checking in. Right away, I noticed how warm and welcoming the city felt. There were coffee shops everywhere you looked, which, if you know me, is always a good sign. My room was spacious, comfortable, and absolutely perfect for a solo traveler. If you're sailing out of Vancouver, I would definitely recommend the Georgian Court Hotel. It's right in downtown, close to everything, and it even has a restaurant where I enjoyed breakfast the next morning before heading to the port. The next morning after breakfast, I grabbed an Uber and headed to the cruise terminal. The port is only a few minutes away from downtown, and at first glance, it looked extremely busy since there were two ships boarding that day. One thing that's important to know is that you don't immediately hand over your luggage when you get dropped off. Instead, you'll take your luggage inside and walk a short distance to the baggage drop area. Once your bags are checked, you'll proceed through customs and the check-in process. It may look a little chaotic at first, but if you simply follow the signs and directions from the staff, you'll be fine. Honestly, once I got through customs and checked in, I was on board within about 10 minutes. And you already know what the very first thing I do is when I board a ship, muster station. I had already watched the safety video on the Royal Caribbean app beforehand, which made the process even quicker. After that, I headed up to the pool deck to enjoy my first views of Vancouver and check in with my followers to let everyone know I had officially made it on board. It was raining, but I came prepared. I grabbed a quick bite from the buffet, which was definitely busy, and then headed over to the North Star for a view of Vancouver. That rain made visibility a little challenging, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. Raincoat and all, up I went. One of the coolest parts of embarkation day was experiencing a nighttime sail away. Because of the tides, we had to wait until the conditions were right before passing beneath the Lionsgate Bridge. Watching this massive ship carefully navigate under the bridge while the city lights glowed behind us was such a memorable experience. Looking back at Vancouver as we slowly sailed away made the whole trip finally feel real. After a long embarkation day, I woke up early the next morning for one very important thing, coffee. Now here's something I did differently on this cruise. I skipped the drink package. Instead, I purchased Royal Caribbean's coffee cart. It uses a punch system, and depending on the size of your drink, it uses 1, 2, or 3 punches. I typically stayed with medium-sized drinks. What I liked is that any unused punches can be carried over to your next Royal Caribbean cruise. For me, this worked perfectly. I also brought a bottle of wine on board that I could enjoy with dinner or while relaxing after a day in port. I even ordered bottled water for the cabin, although I didn't realize they would be 1-liter bottles. I ended up sharing some with fellow passengers who needed water. Overall, this setup worked fantastic for me and will probably be how I cruise Royal Caribbean moving forward. I also tried the sea day brunch in the main dining room for the first time. It was nice having a quieter sit-down breakfast experience compared to the Windjammer. Sea days have always been my time to recharge. I don't feel pressure to do every activity on board. I don't feel the need to see every show. For me, sea days are about slowing down, relaxing, people watching, listening to music, enjoying the ocean, and of course, eating, sleeping, and repeating. I spent time walking around the ship, window shopping, getting dressed up for dinner, and simply enjoying the atmosphere. One of my favorite moments was watching the sunset from my balcony. Although I have to admit, this was probably the coldest sunset I've ever watched at sea. The following sea day was much of the same. Coffee on the balcony, ocean views, relaxation, mentally preparing myself for Alaska's colder temperatures. No matter how chilly it was, I still found myself spending plenty of time out on that balcony. I also enjoyed a few shows, including the Sexiest Men Alive competition, which was absolutely hilarious. Watching participants from different countries compete and have fun was entertaining from start to finish. That evening, I attended Spectre's Cabaret after dinner. The visuals and atmosphere were beautiful, and while I wasn't entirely sure what the storyline was supposed to be, it definitely delivered that unique cabaret feel. The next morning, I woke up early and immediately opened the balcony curtains, and oh my gosh, the scenery was absolutely beautiful. This was our arrival into Ketchikan, our very first port in Alaska, and the beginning of many incredible views throughout the week. Now tell me I'm not the only one who wakes up and immediately checks the balcony to make sure the ocean's still out there, because I do, every single time. After taking in the views, I headed up to the Windjammer for a quick breakfast. One thing I quickly learned about Alaska cruises is that the buffet gets very busy on port days. Everyone is trying to grab something to eat before heading out to explore. Now, I had done my homework before arriving. I heard that Ketchikan is one of the rainiest cities in Alaska, so I packed accordingly. And sure enough, it was raining. One thing I really appreciated was that our captain would make weather announcements before arriving in port. He would tell us the expected conditions and even recommended what we should bring. That was incredibly helpful. I had my rain jacket, but I quickly realized something. Even with the hood, rain still manages to hit your face. Thankfully, I had packed a baseball cap and wearing it underneath my hood worked perfectly. So if you're heading to Alaska, that's a little tip that might come in handy. After enjoying my coffee on the balcony, I headed down to the gangway and into town. Originally, I didn't have an excursion booked to Ketchikan, but once I got off the ship, I noticed several local tour operators offering excursions at a fraction of the cruise line's price. That's when I found Sourdough Tours, and off I went. Our guide Todd was absolutely fantastic. He was knowledgeable, funny, and somehow managed to keep us entertained the entire time. At one point, the bus window kept fogging up, and we ended up joking that we were his windshield wipers because we kept wiping the window so everyone could see. The first stop was the Totem Heritage Center. There, we met Miss Twyla Silverson, who has been carving and teaching about Native Alaskan culture since she was 15 years old. How cool is that? Listening to her explain the history and significance behind the totem poles made the experience so much more meaningful. Listening to her explain the history and significance behind the totem poles made the experience so much more meaningful. We learned about how they were made, what they represented, and the stories behind them. We also got to see native animal displays and sip of the famous salmon dip, which, by the way, was delicious. Our next stop was the Totem Bight State Historical Park. We walked among the towering totem poles while learning even more about their history and significance. There was also a beautiful forest trail that gave us a small taste of Alaska wilderness. The final stop that really stood out involved bald eagles. Todd tossed out salmon, and before long, these magnificent birds came swooping down. Seeing bald eagles flying freely around Ketchikan was something special. The tour ended at Creek Street, and wow, this place looked like something out of a postcard. The colorful buildings, wooden walkways, and waterfront views made it one of the most picturesque places I have visited all week. Honestly, if someone had dropped me there without telling me where it was, I might have guessed a small town somewhere in Europe. After the tour ended, I spent more time exploring Ketchikan on foot. Even though I was cold, even though I was wet, I pushed through because every corner seemed to have another beautiful view, another local shop, or another piece of history waiting to be discovered. This is also where you'll find the famous Welcome to Ketchikan sign if you're looking for that iconic photo. As we sailed away later that evening, the rain finally started to clear and the sun even peeked out for a little while. Of course, it waited until we were leaving. Isn't that always how it works? Before departure, we were delayed for several hours due to a medical emergency and a random inspection. But in the end, Ketchikan was absolutely worth it. There's just something magical about waking up in a completely different place every morning. It's one of the reasons I love cruising so much. Each port brought different scenery, different experiences, and different weather. And Sitka was no exception. The morning started in the mid-30s, but by the afternoon, temperatures climbed into the mid-40s, and I was actually peeling layers off. This is exactly why I tell everyone that layers are your best friend in Alaska. The weather can change in a matter of minutes. After breakfast, I headed ashore. I didn't have an excursion booked here either, but I had reserved a shuttle time into town. Unlike many other cruise ports, the ship docks several minutes away from downtown Sitka. A few days before arrival, you'll receive instructions to reserve your shuttle times if you're exploring independently. The process was simple. After a short ride, I arrived at the visitor center and was free to explore. And I absolutely loved Sitka. It was charming, walkable, beautiful, and packed with history. I visited a church, a museum that was once an orphanage, stopped for coffee, and somehow found myself eating street tacos at 10 o'clock in the morning. But honestly, who says no to tacos? Not me. One of my favorite things about Sitka was learning about its fascinating connection to Russia and its history before Alaska became part of the United States. I also learned that Sitka was once Alaska's capital before Juneau. Walking around the harbor with snow-capped mountains surrounding the town felt almost surreal. It was peaceful, beautiful, and incredibly photogenic. After returning to the ship and enjoying one of the best feelings cruising, coming back to our freshly cleaned cabin after a long day of exploring, I got ready for dinner. That evening featured a Caribbean-inspired menu in the main dining room, followed by one of the funniest shows I've ever seen on board, Mark Savert's comedy hypnosis show. Whether the participants were genuinely hypnotized or just going along with it, I honestly have no idea. But I laughed so hard my cheeks hurt. If you ever sail on Ovation of the Seas and have the opportunity to see that show, do it. The next morning, I woke up to what may have been the most stunning views of the entire cruise. As we sailed into Skagway, it felt like the mountains were so close you could almost reach out and touch them. No matter how many times I stepped out onto my balcony, I never got tired of the scenery. It simply never got old. Now, Skagway greeted us with temperatures in the low 30s, plenty of wind and light drizzle. In other words, coffee first, then layers, lots of layers. After finishing my morning coffee and taking in the views from the balcony, I headed down to begin my day. There are a few things you should know if you're visiting Skagway. Passengers first board a tram that takes you from the ship to the main port area. From there, you can either walk into town, join your excursion group, or catch one of the local shuttles. Due to the landslide that occurred several years ago, the area around the dock is considered unsafe for pedestrian traffic. Protective barriers have been installed along the mountainside, so guests are not allowed to walk directly between the ship and the pier area. Once I arrived at the excursion meeting point, it was finally time for something I had been looking forward to for months, the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad. And let me tell you, this was hands down one of the most incredible excursions I have ever done. As the train slowly climbed higher into the mountains, the scenery became more breathtaking with every mile. Towering peaks, waterfalls, snow-covered landscapes, deep valleys. Every turn revealed another view that looked like it belonged on a postcard. But one of my favorite parts of the excursion wasn't just the scenery, it was the people. The group in our train car was absolutely wonderful. Everyone was friendly, funny, and genuinely excited to be there. I met Kate from Wales, who was also traveling solo. She had actually been on board for a week already after boarding in Japan. I also met Kristen, who was sitting in another section of the train, equally determined to photograph every beautiful view we passed. One of the best features of the train is that you're allowed to step outside onto the rear platform between cars. And if you know me, you know I wasn't just about to miss that opportunity. Was it cold? Absolutely. Was it windy? Even worse, but I kept going back outside anyways. I would step out, take photos and videos, freeze for a few minutes, go back inside to warm up, and then head right back out again when the next incredible view appeared. And honestly, that's where I experienced one of my favorite moments of the entire trip. Standing on that train, watching Alaska pass by, breathing in the cold mountain air. There was just a sense of peace that is difficult to put into words. For a few hours, none of the noise from everyday life mattered. No schedules. No stress, no notifications, just nature, just beauty, just being fully present in the moment. It reminded me how incredible this world really is when we slow down long enough to appreciate it. So if you're ever visiting Skagway, let me make this recommendation very clear. Put the White Pass Railroad on your must-do list. Even if it's the only excursion you book during your Alaska cruise, do it at least once. You won't regret it. After returning from the excursion, I headed into downtown Skagway. Now here's a little mistake I'd made. I decided to wait for the shuttle into town. Bad idea. If you don't have mobility concerns, just walk. It's only about a 5-minute to 7-minute walk. Because of the drizzle, I figured the shuttle would be easier. Instead, I spent about 15 to 20 minutes standing in line, waiting. Once I finally made it into town, it was busy. Very busy. There were 4 or 5 cruise ships in port that day, and you could definitely feel it. The streets were packed, souvenir shops were crowded, and some stores had lines stretching right out the door. I spent some time walking around, picking up a few souvenirs, and taking in the atmosphere. Downtown Skagway definitely gave me an Old West feel. I would absolutely love to return one day and spend more time exploring, preferably on a less crowded day. One thing to note if you're visiting Skagway, the shuttle charges $3 one way or $5 round trip, and cash is definitely the easiest option. They do offer a QR code and app payment option, but when I was there, the cell signal was so spotty that many people had trouble getting it to work. Thankfully, on my ride into town, the driver simply waved me through. On the way back, I decided walking was much faster. As beautiful as Skagway was, this was also the day that brought the biggest disappointment of the cruise. As we sailed away from port, the captain made an announcement, and immediately I knew something wasn't right. Because of the change in our disembarkation port from Seward to Whittier, combined with the traffic restrictions from the Whittier tunnel, the ship would not be able to safely visit Hubbard Glacier and still get everyone home on time. As a result, our glacier viewing day was canceled. I'm not gonna lie, my heart sank. Of course I was disappointed. I think anyone would have been. Hubbard Glacier was one of the experiences I had been looking forward to most. Eventually, though, I accepted it and decided I wasn't going to let it ruin the rest of my vacation. Royal Caribbean did provide onboard credit based on cabin category, but the credit had to be used within 24 hours. Personally, I would have preferred future cruise credit instead, but that was just my opinion. Other passengers, however, were much more upset, and honestly, I understand why. Many people book Alaska specifically for glacier viewing. The next couple of days, guest services looked absolutely overwhelmed. The lines were some of the longest I've ever seen on a cruise ship. At one point, there were even passengers holding signs in protest. The story eventually made cruise news outlets. I remember feeling bad for the guest services team because none of this was their fault. They were simply the people delivering the message. When I eventually went to guest services myself to sort out transportation questions for disembarkation, I made a point of thanking them for their professionalism. No matter how frustrated passengers were, the crew continued showing up and doing their jobs with patience and grace, and I truly appreciated that. The next day was our final sea day on board, and honestly, I decided to make the best of it. At that point, there wasn't anything I could do about the itinerary changes, so I focused on enjoying what was left of the cruise. I made sure I was well rested, well fed, and determined to enjoy every remaining moment on board. As I walked around the ship, I could still see the disappointment on many passengers' faces. The guest services line remained long and conversations about Hubbard Glacier seemed to be happening everywhere. But eventually, reality sets in. Sometimes things happen that are simply beyond our control. And while we may not like them, we may not agree with them, we have to decide whether we're going to let that ruin the experience or continue making memories. For me, I chose the second option. I spent the day doing what I always enjoy doing on sea days, walking around the ship, people watching, enjoying the ocean views, listening to music, and simply appreciating the fact that I was still surrounded by some of the most beautiful scenery I had ever seen. That evening, I enjoyed my final dinner in the main dining room with the wonderful dining team that had taken care of me throughout the week. One thing I love about cruising is how quickly the crew begins to feel familiar. By the end of the week, they know your preferences, they greet you by name, and it feels like saying goodbye to friends. And then came what I always consider the saddest part of any cruise. Walking down the hallway and seeing everyone's luggage lined up outside their cabins. If you're a cruiser, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's the moment it really hits you. The vacation is almost over. The next morning, I woke up and immediately opened the curtains and wow, whatever disappointment I still had about missing Hubbard Glacier quickly faded as I looked outside. Whittier was absolutely stunning. The snow-covered mountains seemed almost unreal. The weather was cloudy, cold, and at times the scenery looked like something out of a black and white photograph. Everything felt peaceful, quiet, almost untouched. After breakfast, I stepped out onto the balcony one last time. I couldn't get enough of the view. I originally had the Anchorage City Center transfer by train excursion booked from Seward, and thankfully Royal Caribbean was still able to provide a modified version of the experience despite the port change. The train ride itself ended up being shorter than originally planned, about 2.5 hours instead of 5, but I was still grateful we were able to experience it. Passengers met in the theater and were called by group numbers before disembarking. One thing worth mentioning if you're considering this excursion, rolling luggage is not allowed on board the train due to limited storage space. Another thing I noticed was the amount of walking required to reach the transportation staging areas. We walked quite a distance through the port area before reaching the buses that would take us to the train station. I remember seeing a few passengers struggling, especially those with mobility issues. The weather was cold and rainy, and I honestly wish there had been a better transportation option available for those who needed the assistance. Once on board the train, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. We were simply handed our tickets and assigned our seats. As a solo traveler, I was seated with a family of 3. At first, I'll admit, it felt a little awkward. There was that quiet moment where nobody really knows whether to start a conversation, so I broke the ice. I introduced myself, and before long, we were chatting and enjoying the ride together. One of the things I love most about traveling is that complete strangers can become part of your experience, even if only for a few hours. And what an experience it was. The scenery from the train was unbelievable. The glass-domed cars allowed incredible panoramic views no matter where you looked. Mountains, rivers, forests, waterfalls. Every direction offered something beautiful. I think I took hundreds, if not thousands of photos and videos during the train ride alone. One of my favorite moments was spotting mountain goats along the cliffs. Not just goats, baby goats too. I still have no idea how they managed to stand on those steep ledges without falling. Seriously, how do they do that? The train also offered food and drinks for purchase, making the ride comfortable and relaxing. By the time we arrived in Anchorage, I didn't want it to end. Once we arrived in Anchorage, we were directed to the convention center where Royal Caribbean had arranged luggage storage for guests with later flights. I had to give them credit for this. They rented a large conference room, provided seating, snacks, and water, and allowed passengers to store their luggage safely while exploring the city. Throughout the day, shuttle buses transported guests to the airport based on their flight times. Just keep in mind that arriving too early at the airport can be a problem since airlines may not accept your luggage until closer to your departure time. After dropping off my luggage, I met up with 2 friends I had made on board from Mexico. One of my favorite things about cruising is meeting people from all over the world. And these 2 ladies quickly became part of some wonderful memories from the trip. Together, we explored Anchorage, enjoyed lunch at a local restaurant, did some souvenir shopping, and simply enjoyed spending a few more hours together before heading our separate ways. Walking through Anchorage with those snow-capped mountains in the background felt like the perfect ending to an unforgettable week. As my flight home took off later that evening, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened throughout the week. The beautiful scenery, the charming towns, the people I met, the train rides, the unexpected itinerary changes, the disappointments, and the incredible moments that made up this adventure. Alaska was unlike any cruise destination I had ever experienced. As someone who is used to turquoise waters, beaches, palm trees, and Caribbean sunsets, Alaska showed me a completely different side of cruising, and honestly, I loved it. This trip reminded me that there's so much beauty in this world beyond the places we already know. The older I get, the more I find myself appreciating nature. The mountains, the forests, the wildlife, the quiet moments, the simple moments. Did everything go perfectly? No. Would I have loved to see Hubbard Glacier? Absolutely. Would I cruise Alaska again? Without hesitation. In fact, Alaska, I'll be back. I am grateful to the people of Alaska, the crew of Ovation of the Seas, and everyone who helped me make this journey special. Despite the hiccups, the itinerary changes, and a few disappointments along the way, I came home with memories that will stay with me forever. The White Pass Railroad alone was worth the trip. The beautiful towns of Ketchikan, Sitka, and Skagway were unforgettable. And simply sailing through those incredible landscapes was an experience I will never forget. So if Alaska is on your bucket list, my advice is simple. Book the cruise. You won't regret it. If you enjoyed this Alaska cruise review and found it helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps support my channel and lets YouTube know you'd like to see more content like this. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can follow along on future cruise adventures, travel tips, ship reviews, and destination guides. Have you cruised Alaska before? Or is Alaska still on your bucket list? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear about your experiences and answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. Until next time, see you at the next port.